I think Trump has been outspoken recently about pardoning Assange, so it could have become a real debate leading up to the November poll.
Yeah, totally. No, Donald Trump has been very outspoken about that. You know, like I said, I have no particularly strong underlying sympathy for Julian Assange, but he probably has already paid his punishment. I mean, he's essentially been in exile there in the embassy over in the UK, you know, for years and years now. So, you know, good for this whole situation that it's in the rearview mirror. The story's been dragging out for many, many years now. But I think you're probably right, Rita. This is probably Joe Biden trying not to let Donald Trump get there on a debate stage potentially as early as this week, this Thursday evening here in the U.S., and say that he's going to pardon Julian Assange and then steal Joe Biden's thunder for him.
Now, the next story has the potential to upset some viewers. Prosecutors in Texas will argue the illegal migrants who stand accused of murdering a 12-year-old girl in Houston. They say these men lured the girl under a bridge, tied her up, stripped her naked from the waist down, assaulted her for 2 hours, then strangled her and dumped her body in the water. If evidence is found that this girl was sexually assaulted, Josh, the accused could face the death penalty.
Age is not the only consideration in this case or any case. The underlying actions of the criminals. This victim was found, you know, bound and without clothing from the waist down in the water.
The DA's office says that they are waiting on results of testing to determine if a sexual assault happened. If they find that that happened, this case would be eligible for the death penalty in the state of Texas.
Josh, these men crossed illegally into the US earlier this year. They had initially been fitted with ankle monitors, but one of them cut it off and the other had it removed after it was determined he had no known criminal history.
You know, Rita, Bill Malugin is a very talented Fox News reporter who here in the U.S. tracks the immigration issue very closely. And he had a tweet on Friday that I was studying very carefully where he said that even holding aside illegal immigration, just holding aside and looking at legal immigration, there have now been over 1 million migrants who have come in through the Customs and Border Protection One mobile app between the ports of entry of the U.S. southern border, along with the Biden administration's very under-discussed mass parole program, where he's basically flying in migrants from a lot of Latin American countries in the dark of the night, shipping them to the interior of the country. That's what's being done, quote unquote, legally. So imagine how bad the illegal situation is. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. Read, this has happened in Houston, Texas. I lived in Houston, Texas. In fact, when I was clerking for a federal judge based in Texas, I actually remember reading a very dark and graphic criminal case along these lines. It was an international sex trafficking ring involving MS-13, the cartels, based there in Houston, Texas. They had underage girls as sex slaves. Horrific stuff. Anyone who cares, ultimately, at the end of the day, anyone who cares about human rights, justice, all the concepts that these far left progressives claim to care about, if you care about that, you have to support a secure border, because the United States southern border being the way that it is right now is the most inhumane, most unjust thing imaginable. And as it comes to these illegal aliens who obviously by definition of being illegal aliens never, ever, ever should have been in the country in the first place. They're not alone, by the way. Laken Riley in Georgia, we saw what happened to her. She was murdered. In New York City, you had an illegal alien who appears to have raped a 13-year-old girl as well. This is happening all across the country. But when it comes to these people in Texas, I'm a barred attorney still in Texas. I live in Florida, but I'm still a barred attorney in Texas. The death penalty is very much still good law in Texas. These two people, if they are determined to be the culprits there, they should fry at least once, ideally multiple times for this.
Now, you mentioned the leftist progressives, and the ones on MSNBC seem to be utterly divorced from reality. I played footage yesterday of MSNBC host Simone Sanders discussing this case, but she seems to be preoccupied with the term illegal immigrants. She thinks that's not proper. Watch this footage.
What do you tell the parents of those people, those young girls who were killed? This is absurdity. The preponderance of these people, Michael, are male.
But what is the difference between an illegal immigrant who unfortunately engages in that activity.
And we don't like that. I want to be clear. We don't do the term illegal. So
yeah, we don't,
undocumented individuals.
Josh, what can you say about that? We can't say illegal immigrant to describe an illegal immigrant. We've got to use the word undocumented because it's more PC. I mean, talk about completely losing sight of the real issue here.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was George Orwell who famously said that he who controls the language controls the population. The left has been doing a very, very good job of this in recent years in the United States. In fact, they've actually been doing it for a much longer time as well. You can go back as far, Rita, as the 1960s, back during the John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson presidencies, when they started passing civil rights legislation. One of their landmark pieces of legislation was called the Voting Rights Act. And there's this famous Supreme Court oral argument from 2013 where the late, great conservative Justice Antonin Scalia is talking to the lawyers arguing, and he goes, the Voting Rights Act. What kind of congressman in their right name would ever vote against a bill called the Voting Rights Act? So the fix is kind of in when they come to naming bills, when they come to naming identity groups here. But, this individual on MSNBC, how hard is it to actually use the term illegal when someone is here illegally? These are people whose literal first act, their physical foot stepping across the Rio Grande into this country is an act of illegality and criminality. They are illegal aliens still under U.S. law, and the left-wing media should say it what it is. They are illegal aliens. Say it. Illegal. It's not that hard, honestly.
Well, for the left, often saying the truth is very difficult indeed. That's why they would like to come up with prettier words that hide the real issues. I want to talk to you about the ESG phenomenon. MasterCard is being pressured by ESG activists to drop support for organisations such as the State Financial Officers Foundation. ESG, it stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, but it seems to be, Josh, just a way to push the leftist agenda in the corporate world using shareholders' money. And it's not just MasterCard that's being targeted by these activists. You've got JP Morgan, Lockheed Martin, a whole bunch of corporates. And I wonder just how influential and powerful is this ESG philosophy in the corporate world?
So I think it reached its apex probably a year to a year and a half ago. It's actually been on the decline, is my understanding, since then. ESG, Rita, I think is best viewed as the financial wing of the broader DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion movement. So the DEI is kind of the social aspect. That's how you get the woke stuff on university campuses. ESG is basically just the investing financial element of that. But, it's the major institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. It's firms like that, really, who were the biggest proponents of ESG, especially BlackRock, probably above all. Larry Fink, the CEO there, was all in on the ESG agenda in recent years there. But they actually started pulling back on ESG. I think it was the Wall Street Journal had a long, deep dive of an essay on this last year because the very simple reason, Rita, there's no demand for it anymore. I mean, the American people and investors don't want this because, reasonably speaking, when you invest, Rita, what do you want? You want returns. You want ROI. You want a return on investment.
Was there ever any real demand for it, or was it just something that was pushed by the corporate activist class? Because I can't imagine shareholders being preoccupied with this stuff. Shareholders want a return on their money, and this seems to be just relentless leftist activism masquerading as some sort of corporate responsibility.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there was never demand for this because, again, people who are living paycheck to paycheck with a pension fund, a retirement fund, whatever, they just want money, for goodness sake. They don't particularly care how it's done as long as it's legal, right? You know what this reminds me of, actually, the whole ESG debate? It reminds me, actually, of the whole Bud Light, Dylan Mulvaney fiasco that happened here in the U.S. a little over a year ago, where Bud Light had the transgender influencer. I mean, was there really a demand among kind of college frat boys for drinking a beer with a transgender individual like printed on the logo? No, of course not. I mean, this is some harebrained idea from some Ivy League MBA graduate who thought this would be a good agenda. And Bud Light, by the way, paid the price for it. And that's what you're starting to see now when it comes to ESG, when it comes to BlackRock, Vanguard. There's just no demand for it. And finally, they're actually just pulling these investment funds from their shelves.
Well, this is another example of that. IBM is facing a lawsuit from Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey over its diversity quotas. This is the DEI program, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. Bailey calls it corporate racism. He's accusing the company of violating the Missouri Human Rights Act by subjecting job applicants to unlawful racial quotas, blatantly favouring applicants of certain skin colour over others, and basing employees' pay and employment status on whether they participate in these discriminatory practices. This is a turn up for the books, and I think we're going to see more lawsuits like this because it is corporate racism. They're not even ashamed of it. They promote these programs.
Yeah, they shout it from the rooftops. I mean, they are extraordinarily proud of the fact that at the corporate level, they are increasingly openly and overtly discriminating against, white male Christians would be the absolute, the highest quote unquote oppressor status, right? But, it's also Asians, Jews, obviously, any number of other groups as well here. Good for Missouri. This is a good lawsuit. When you have a Democratic administration, a very activist Democratic administration like the Biden administration in place, probably the single most effective tip of the spear in terms of fighting back, especially with the U.S. Congress as divided as it is going to come from the state level. And that's going to come from the various Republican attorneys general. We're fortunate right now where we have a number of high-profile Republican attorneys general. Ken Paxton in Texas would probably be the #1 most vocal and most active. So it's really encouraging to see others besides Ken Paxton step up. Here in Florida, we have Ashley Moody, who's also done a pretty good job of late pushing back on the Biden administration's Title IX transgender policy, things like that. So it's really good from a perspective of wanting to stop the woke agenda more broadly speaking, of seeing Republican attorney generals step up. So good for the state of Missouri when it comes to this particular lawsuit. Hopefully more will follow.
Now, before you go, I've got to ask you about the latest polls. Donald Trump is leading Joe Biden in all 7 swing states, according to some recent polling, despite the Democrats' lawfare and political prosecutions. In 2020, Biden won 6 of the 7 swing states. And we've got the great debate happening this Friday, our time. How can Biden recover in the polls? What can the Democrats and their institutional allies do to fortify another election?
It's a great question. I mean, their candidate is in very, very bad shape right now, not just politically, but obviously physically and mentally as well. Nothing is going particularly well right now for the Biden-Harris campaign. And it's funny because Joe Biden has essentially been locked up at Camp David at the presidential compound in suburban Maryland for the past week while he's trying to prepare for this debate. Apparently, he realized that the stakes are very high, although I have to say, Rita, that does raise the obvious question as to who is running the country when he's just holed up there at Camp David preparing for this debate. I mean, who's managing the world's largest economy? I actually have no idea, to be honest with you. But the stakes are obviously extremely high in this debate. Now, the expectations have been set so low that if Joe Biden essentially stands up there and gets at least a few coherent sentences in, and if he doesn't keel over and has to be rushed to the ER before it's over, they will probably be able to chalk it up in the Democratic Party's fundraising emails as some sort of win. So lowering expectations is half the battle, but they're going to have to come up with something more than that. They're going to run very hard on the abortion issue. They're going to try to do the whole 2012 playbook, the so-called Republican war on women. They're trying to gin that up, but it's not working, Rita, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the voters here care about the economy, inflation, crime, and the open border issue. And those are the issues, frankly, that Joe Biden has failed epically on, and independent and swing state voters see it for what it is, I think.
Josh Hammer, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you.